Okay, good morning everyone. Sorry about the delayed start here. Um, Welcome to Friday, everyone's favorite day, right? Although it's a little bit wet and rainy, but I don't know. I think it's kind of pretty, isn't it, when you look out the window?
Pretty wet, you know.
Yeah.
The rain came through my jacket to my t-shirt.
Oh yeah.
It's quite pretty.
Yeah.
It's pretty, but when the water gets in your shoes, oh, it destroys your mood the whole day.
Oh yeah. Wet shoes are not.
Wet socks too.
Wet socks are not fun. You could bring a second pair of socks with you, I guess, if your socks are getting
Or
wet.
you can buy a waterproof shoe.
Yeah, I have to.
Or that. Or that. But yeah, I don't know. I like it. I think it's kind of pretty, and then when you get home, you can be all cozy and have some
Yeah.
warm food, and it's raining outside, and yeah,
Tasting experiencing for the first time.
Yeah.
Darkness, you know. It's
Yeah.
getting darker.
yeah,
It's so late.
Especially it's Saturday tomorrow, so you can sleep in.
yeah.
Ah.
Have a nice sleep in tomorrow. But yeah, it gets dark. It's dark early, right? And stays dark.
I heard it's going to get darker at 4 p.m.
It's get for the next, yeah, until December 21st. The day will get shorter. Not by so much now. Like the change is more dramatic early on, and then it's just a little bit. And so, yeah, the days will continue to get shorter until December 21st, and then they'll.
I've never seen snow. Is it a chance to snow this year?
What's that?
I've never seen snow. Is it a chance to snow?
You've never seen snow? Well, we've had snow every year for the past few years, I think. For the past 5 years, we've had snow every year. Sometimes twice, and sometimes quite a bit. So, I think your odds of seeing some snow this year are pretty good. Although, if you go up Grouse Mountain, you will definitely see snow. But down here, yeah, I think there's a good chance.
Oh,
Good.
when we set back our clocks an hour late, do we?
You don't have to do anything. Your phones will automatically
How about going
recalibrate.
to school? I don't want to be late, right?
Yeah, no, that's okay. Your phone will automatically reset. So just set your alarm for your normal time,
Like the
and
time will increase 1 hour?
yeah, it'll go back 1 hour.
So technically, we're going to school like an hour late, or
Yeah,
When will be?
you'll get an extra hour of sleep.
When will that happen?
What's that?
When will that happen?
When? It usually happens kind of around 1 or 2 in the morning on, I think it's Saturday night.
On November?
Yeah, on this weekend. This weekend. So, but as I say, you don't have to do anything. Once upon a time, you had to change all of you'll have to change your watch if you have one, or you'll have to change your microwave or things
when
like
is
that.
that gonna turn back to like the normal time?
In spring, it switches.
Uncle told me the last year was the last time the time changed. It's not going to change anymore. But
No, we're still doing it.
okay.
We're still doing it. Yeah. So on the weekend, again, it'll be in the middle of the night. Your clock will automatically jump back an hour. And so when you wake up in the morning, you'll have the correct time, and you can just continue on your day.
So we'll have to wake up earlier, 1 hour early,
Nope, later.
because the time is very late.
Yeah, because so if you had to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, 6 o'clock is actually 5 o'clock in the morning. So you get an extra hour to get to 6. Yeah. So you'll get one extra hour. Of course, in spring you'll lose an hour, but that's
That's a relief.
that's later. Yeah.
It's confusing.
It's a little weird, but as I say, it's much easier with like mobile phones now, because the phones will just reset themselves.
Yeah.
So just look at
Automatic time of day.
yeah, just look at your phone. That's the right time.
We don't do that in my country, so it's pretty new.
Yeah, because of how early it gets dark here, right?
I knew this method earlier when I was in my country.
Yeah,
I had friends over here. You know Maya?
I know Maya.
I used to contact her about things I do.
Yeah.
So she used to tell me the time changes.
Yep.
Winter.
Yeah, but yeah, we'll go back an hour on the weekend, and then in spring, probably in March or something like that, I forget the date, we'll go one forward, and you'll lose an hour of sleep, but we'll deal with that in spring.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is the good one where you get an extra hour. Okay, let's get going here. Let's get going here, people. Unadi is here, so good morning, Unadi. Jesse is here. Hello, Jesse. Harry is here. Good morning, Harry. Adon is here. Hello. We'll see you soon. Dunya is here. Good morning. Kayla is here. Good morning. And Alicia is here. Good morning, Alicia. All right. So, yesterday we were talking about the social construction of race in the United States, right? And it's important to kind of think about race as a social construction, because remember, it's not a biological reality, right? Race is not a thing in humans. There is one human race, all of us, right? In biological terms. Of course, there's lots of different cultures and languages and ethnicities, right? We're different in lots of ways, but biologically speaking, we are not, right? And so race is a thing that is socially constructed. Humans agree that it's a thing, and so it becomes a thing, right? Humans create laws and rules that are based around race, and it becomes an important thing, and it affects people's lives to a pretty significant degree, which we'll get to a bit later. We said, of course, that this race thing was very helpful in colonization, but also in the founding of the United States, right? Because the United States was founded on freedom and justice and happiness, but of course, there were lots of people in the United States who would not receive those things, right? Black Africans who had been brought over were slaves on cotton plantations, right? Yeah, and indigenous people would have their land taken away from them, and they'd be pushed aside, right? And as more kind of non-white immigrants came to the United States, they would kind of be, kept at the bottom of the social ladder as well, right? So again, you have this kind of awkward tension, right? Freedom and happiness, but oops, not for everybody.
Are we going to learn about indigenous people and racism?
Coming up. So we said yesterday that science kind of helped this along, right? This idea that non-white people were inferior, right? They were just not as good as white people, right? And so we were talking yesterday about this guy Blumenbach, right, who measured skulls and thought that he could determine that there were 5 human races, which of course there are not, but he thought he could see 5 human races. There they are. And of course, he also ascribed characters to them as well, right? And I think we read about that in the article yesterday, right? They said that Africans were, or here that says Ethiopians. Africans here were sluggish, right? And Asian people were melancholy, right? And Americans, which are like American Indians, Americans are aggressive, right? And it's like, it's ridiculous when you think about it, because it's like, when you enslave people, of course they're sluggish. Of course they don't want to work because you're making them work, right? Yeah. American Indians are aggressive. Well, of course they're aggressive. You're trying to take their land, right? Like, of course they're not going to go along with it. But anyway, sorry, I'm getting off track here.
How does the Persian pronounce?
Caucasian. Yeah, so those are white people. Hello. Nice to meet you. So those are white people. And again, there's no truth to these, right?
They're scary.
Well, I guess they're all skulls, right? There are.
Mongolians are yellow people?
What's that?
I think Mongolians are yellow people.
Yeah, I think Mongolian are like Eastern Asian people. So Mongolia, China, Southeast Asia. I think they would fit into that category. Or would they? Yeah, they would. So we had kind of like Asian people, Malayan people. I think are like South Asia, like yourself. Ethiopian are Africans. Americans are indigenous people, and then we have Caucasian people, white people, right? So
South Asia is like quite big. Like different countries have different cultures there. Like in my country, the cultures our country has doesn't match with like Malayan cultures or Indonesian cultures.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing, right? Is that cultures are learned, right? And so they kind of are. They're not the same as biology, of course. And in this case, this biology stuff doesn't. This is not science right here. Although there are some broad differences in terms of some cranial measurements between populations, but not like this. You can't identify races with humans by measuring their skulls. Firstly, because there just aren't any races, right? So this was kind of junk science. As you can see here, Blumenbach had some pretty racist ideas based on biblical teaching, thinking that non-white people had somehow degenerated, but they could sort of become white again if they, I don't know, behaved properly or took care of themselves. I don't know. It's craziness, right? It's all craziness. But at the time, it wasn't craziness. At the time, it was thought of as fact, right? Same thing, there was stuff like phrenology here that showed up that thought that you could, determine personal characteristics based on looking at the inside of someone's skull, right? Again, bonkers. You can't do that. The regions of the brain do not map out in this way at all. So, yeah, it's junk, right? It's junk science. There's no value to this. Yeah, but again, people tried to use science to justify their beliefs that non-white people were inferior, right, to white people. We watched a little video yesterday, and it. Sorry, I'm just going to back up. We watched a little video yesterday, and it. Oh, I'm missing a slide. And it talked about. I talked a little bit about how, how races are determined, right? And in some cases, yes, you can identify yourself as one race or the other, probably within reason. I don't think I could identify as a black person, right? I don't think anyone would go along with that. But part of it has to do with how the government kind of thinks of you, right? And particularly in the United States, being white had certain kind of privileges and rights and access to resources associated with it, right? So lots of people wanted to be thought of as white, at least by the government, and lots of people actually fought to be recognized as white, right? But there was also some, so we saw where the government changed the definition of who was white depending on who they wanted to bring in the labor force, right, for Mexican immigrants. But we also saw in that video how people were identified as black, right? And so in some places it was a quarter of your ancestry, right? In some cases it was if you had one grandparent that was black, you were thought of as black. In some states it was the one drop rule, right? So if you had any black ancestor anywhere in your family tree, suddenly you were thought of as black, right? And so you can see a very kind of real attempt to make sure that black people are kind of cut off from resources and rights, right? Any kind of black ancestry was enough to label you as black and therefore deny you certain rights, right, and privileges. Yeah. So there's kind of there was a high bar, a high threshold for being thought of as white, right? And on a similar topic, it's kind of funny. There's when those DNA tests started coming out, 23andMe and Ancestry and stuff like that, lots of white supremacists in the United States started testing their DNA because they were like, oh, I'll see all of my white ancestors. And it turns out lots of them had black people in their ancestry that they just didn't know about. So it was kind of funny that
like
they were.
From the Middle Ages, like Fijians used to be from the lower side of the group.
Sorry? From
In Middle Ages,
yeah.
we were the Fijians.
Fijians?
Fijians.
Peasant?
As in, from the Middle Age.
Oh,
there used to
peasants?
be- Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
Sorry, I'm pronouncing.
It's okay.
There used to be like more black people because they were the inferior group at that time.
Well,
When the kings used to rule in the Middle Ages.
perhaps, like in your part of the world, or in
No,
Europe.
in the entire world.
Oh, well, I don't think there were many. I don't think there were many black people in Europe prior to the slave trade, like prior to colonization. Yeah, I think that would be, probably a few, but I think, yeah, I think, yeah, those populations really started to move as the slave trade started to move them. But a little bit later in history, yeah, they would have been, yeah, they would have been used, right, as property, right, as slaves. So yeah, the video here kind of showed us that not only, you can identify yourself as a certain race, but also the government and society will identify you as well, right? In some ways, you don't really get to say who you are. It's kind of who society sees you as, right? But also there's a government element too, and because the rules differed at different times in history, you could actually change races, right? We saw, according to that one drop rule, you could actually be seen as a black person by the government of Texas, and then you could move to Colorado, and the Colorado government would see you as a white person. So you could change races just by switching states, right? Which again doesn't change who you are, but it changes how people see you.
The view of people.
Yeah. But the important thing to remember there is that it's not really about color of skin so much, but it's about who gets access to resources, right? And who gets denied them. And so, again, depending on the state you live in, you might have different rights or different privileges. And again, it's connected to race, right? So, again, no biological foundation to race, but it did develop into a social idea with very real consequences, right? So, again, we see the term white first coming up in 17th century colonial law in the United States. So that's even before the United States is a country, right? Before the United States exists, there are mentions of race in their colonial law, right?
People used to discriminate race even before the 17th century.
Yep. It starts with colonization, right? So it starts maybe in the 15 and 1600s. And
At that time, people didn't use the term black or white.
they would probably use they'd probably use other terms that we don't really use anymore. But yeah, there was a distinction was made, right? And yeah, you can see here as time went on, people were asked to claim their race on the census, right? So the government knew how many of each race they had. For indigenous people, the degree of blood determined who would be classified as indigenous. So again, how many of your ancestors are indigenous? That kind of determines what you are. And again, as immigrants kind of continued to arrive in the United States here during the 18th to 20th centuries, the conception of whiteness became more concrete, right? Meaning that certain people were kind of included in that group and certain people were excluded, right? And again, it was all about rights and privileges and access to power, right? It wasn't so much about the color of your skin. Because again, even Irish immigrants at one time were not considered white. And Irish people are about as white as your sweater there. Yes. So it's not entirely about skin color at this point.
It escalated to another viewpoint.
Yeah.
Behaviors rather than color.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so even though, the U.S. has kind of a history of slavery, right? So there are lots of black Africans who were brought to United States and to other places in North and South America to be agricultural workers, basically, but enslaved agricultural workers.
Mostly coal mining.
Yeah. But even after that, even after slavery was abolished in 1865, right? So after the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States, frees the slaves famously. But still, you know, the end of slavery doesn't mean that, you know, racism is over, right? And in fact, it's just kind of getting going, right? Because still citizenship is only available to white people. Citizenship was only available to white people. Voting was not available to black people, right? There were a number of states passed a number of laws. They were called Jim Crow laws. And the laws basically made sure that even though slavery was now illegal, it made sure that black people remained at the bottom of the social ladder, where they belonged according to the people at the time, right? So even though the federal government of the US said, okay, slavery is over, people are free, a bunch of states, particularly in the southern United States, moved to make sure that black people weren't able to be too free, right? They weren't able to have too many rights. And as we'll talk about later, organizations like the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, they appear to also make sure that black people don't exercise too much of that freedom, right? So even though slavery ends, you know, discrimination, pretty serious discrimination continues, and racism, right? What's that? Yeah, it did. Yeah, so in the United States, you know, race is about skin color and it is about ancestry, but it's also about other things, right? It's kind of a status you have in society, right? And it gives you certain rights and privileges and opportunities that other people don't have, right? And so, and again, even if you had one black ancestor, right? Maybe you had a black person who was your great-grandmother, right? You could physically appear white, right? No, there would be no kind of evidence that you had a black ancestor, but still that knowledge would be enough to deny you certain rights and privileges, right? And again, that's a race-based society for you right there, just like is described in the article. Now, unfortunately, the race and the social construction of race also plays a role in the creation of Canada. And it would be nice for me to be able to tell you that that's not the case. It would be nice for me to be able to tell you that we're much better than the United States and we never did anything like that. I'd love to be able to tell you that, but of course I cannot, right? So the social construction of race also had something to do with the creation of Canada. Right? And that's kind of, I think, difficult for a lot of Canadians and a lot of Canadians to kind of get their head around, right? Because we seem like a pretty accepting country, don't we? Yeah, and in many ways I think we are.
More than the US.
More than the US, I think that's probably also true. We certainly market ourselves as very multicultural and accepting, right? That's our reputation around the globe. Yeah.
People choose to go to Canada rather than the US because of these reasons.
Yeah, right. Lots of people, and particularly international students, right? They like to come here because of our reputation of being more accepting.
I
Which,
was about to go to the US for
yeah?
college, but I chose to come here instead because I was scared because of like I'm Asian and like I'm afraid they'll like pull a gun on me or they'll beat me up in the US.
Sorry, I'm laughing at that, but that's not funny, right? It's not funny to be scared of that, right? And it's not that bad, right? But still, I think I think Canada does do better in that way. I think we are generally more accommodating of newcomers, but that doesn't mean that, everything is fine, and it certainly doesn't mean that everything was fine in the past, right? And so this is kind of what I wanted to talk to you about here, is that, Canada is also a country that has been founded on racism, right? On the social construction of race. In some ways, it's been a little different than in the U.S. In Canada, at one time, it was legal to keep slaves, and then it wasn't legal later on. But Canada never really had a big slave population like the U.S. did, right? The U.S. was, part of their economy was based on the work of slaves, right? And that just didn't really happen up in Canada. But we have kind of a different dynamic going, and I'll talk to you about that, especially, again, as it relates to Indigenous people here in Canada, right? So, let me start at the very beginning, okay? So, who we're talking about is Canada's Indigenous people, the First People, right? The First Nations. And we call them First Nations or First People because they were literally here first, right? So if you go back in time, if you go back, let's say 20,000 years ago, you will probably find that there is no one in North America or South America at all, okay? So us humans, we evolved in Africa. You can see us evolving there in East Africa. And maybe about 70 or 80,000 years ago, we start to migrate out of Africa, right? Some humans stay there, some migrate out. And eventually they kind of settle all the way through Asia, right? You can see people moving their way through the Indian subcontinent and into Asia. You can see people migrating north up into kind of Central Asia and into Europe. You can see people finding their way into the islands of kind of around Indonesia and Malaysia, finally making it to Australia. And again, some of those migrations were made a lot easier because the sea levels were much lower then than they are now. And so some of those areas that are, are islands today were actually not islands in the past. Or they were kind of a very short boat ride, when today they're a longer boat ride. So people kind of evolved in Africa. We spread out across the globe. But by the time people made it up into kind of Northeast Asia, which is now kind of northeastern Siberia, by the time they made it up there, we were kind of in an ice age. We were in a cooler phase of Earth's history. And so there was a ton of ice basically covering all of Canada, okay? So all of Canada was covered in a sheet of ice about 1 kilometer thick, believe it or not. Yeah, that's a lot of ice, right? So, and you think it's cold now.
Okay,
What's that?
that's very
Uh-huh.
big.
That's
Ice.
huge, hard to imagine, eh? Yeah, so all of Canada was covered in this giant ice sheet. And so what that meant is that you couldn't really get into North America at all, right? So people kind of found their way up into northeastern Russia, and then there was really nowhere to go, right? It was a kind of a wall of ice, if you will. But then, climate change, right? So the Earth starts to warm up a little bit, the ice age kind of ends, ice starts to melt, right? And the seas start to rise as a result, right? That's why the sea levels were so low, because there was so much water locked up in the ice. And so as the ice melts, the sea levels start to rise, and there's this kind of period where eastern Russia and what's now Alaska, those two are actually connected, and you can just walk right across. And that's what people start to do. They start to move across and find their way into North America and then into South America. And so this is around maybe 12,000 years ago or 13,000 years ago. And yeah, these people are literally the first people to arrive in North America. Although the Vikings get here, no, even the Vikings don't get here that early. They're the first people to arrive here. Okay, they're the very first people. And so again, the ice continues to melt, sea levels continue to rise, and so now North America is separate from Northeast Asia there, right? But again, people have moved in, and they start to spread through North and South America, right? So all of the sort of indigenous groups from both of those continents are kind of related to those first people who arrived here thousands of years ago, okay? And of course, since then they would diversify pretty significantly, right? So it's kind of important to note that when we talk about First Nations people here in Canada, we kind of put them all in one bucket, right? We say, okay, First Nations people, here they are, one group. But actually, there are a pretty amazing number of cultures, of different people that make up First Nations in Canada, right? So you can see just some of the different groups here, different indigenous groups. They live in different parts of the country, therefore they live in different environments, therefore they have totally different ways of living, right? They have totally different ways of getting their food, they have different cultures, they have different spiritual beliefs, they have different languages. So indigenous people are, what's that?
They also have different get-ups.
Yeah, they have different, they dress differently, right? Depending on the material that you have, but also the climate that you live in, right? So, yeah, they're actually quite varied. And so indigenous people are not just one group, they're actually quite a few different groups, right? They have similarities, right? They're not 100% different from each other, but they're each culture is kind of a distinct one, right? And each language is a distinct one as well. So, yeah, there's lots, and this is just Canada, right? Never mind the United States and Central America and South America, right? So there's just an unbelievable variety of different cultures that are living here prior to when Europeans get here, okay? So far, so good? You okay there, Eunice?
Yeah.
Okay. So, lots and lots of different people. And so, to kind of tell you this story, or for it to make sense, we have to kind of go back in time a little bit, okay? And so here's the Canada that we all know and love, right? There's us, right in British Columbia there. But when Canada was founded, so when Canada became a country in 1867, this isn't really what Canada looked like, okay? Canada looked a little more like that. And so, as you can see, what was actually Canada were the provinces of Ontario and Quebec, which, as you can see, aren't as big as they are today, right? Ontario and Quebec are pretty big today. At the time, they were kind of just little. And then a few provinces in the east there, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. So that's really all that Canada was. And
British Columbia there was under United Kingdom.
yeah, British Columbia was still a British colony. They hadn't joined. So Canada is kind of it's a country that's kind of like a club, right? And so provinces kind of join the club when they feel they want to, right? So you'll see here that the country starts out in 1867 when these 5 provinces kind of agree that they're going to be in a group together, and then they'll try to get other places to join, right? So for British Columbia, they'll send a telegram to British Columbia and they'll say, hey, do you want to be in our club? It's called Canada and it's cool, right? And British Columbia would say, well, maybe, but we want you to do a few things for us first, like build us a railway so we're not cut off out here in the west, which of course they did. And that railway came pretty much right through where we're sitting, the original railway from 1888. It's not, this is not exactly it, but it's kind of in this area. It's in this area that it would have come through. So, so Canada kind of started out as a as kind of a small country, and most of it was, I was going to say empty, but that's not true, right? Because it was full of indigenous people living there, right? So there were these 5 provinces at the beginning. There was Rupert's Land. Rupert's Land was given to the Hudson's Bay Company so that they could trade. Hudson's Bay Company was around, it was a British company, and it's the same one that still exists. If you go downtown to the bay is the Hudson's Bay Company. It's the same company.
Like there's no Hudson Bay Company, what you're talking about.
Yep.
That's the
Same thing. It's the same company that's been around for hundreds of years. So yeah, at the time, the British government said to the Hudson's Bay Company, Rupert's Land is kind of yours, you can go in there and trade for furs, because that's what the Europeans wanted. They made, you know those fancy top hats? Yeah, they're made of rabbit and beaver fur quite a bit. So they were trading with the indigenous people to get furs to make those fancy hats. So Rupert's Land kind of belonged to the Hudson's Bay Company. There's a Northwest Territory that's kind of up there. British Columbia was sort of a colony thing, but it wasn't a province yet. And so, yeah, even when Canada started out, it wasn't very big, right? And there was a lot of land that still, was the domain of indigenous people. But if we go back even further, you'll see that even before that, Canada wasn't even a country, right? It was just kind of an area, right? It was a place where the British and the French had colonial settlements, right? Probably starting in the 1600s, but then into the 17 and 1800s. Canada comes from an indigenous word for village. That's where Canada's name comes from. It's an indigenous word for village. And so, there's this kind of loose area, and then there was Rupert's Land, there was this Northwestern Territory, and then there was just the beginnings of British Columbia, right? Not much of anything, really. So, when we start out this story, and we'll take a break in just a minute, when we start out this story, most of North America, most of Canada is full of indigenous people, right? And so, as you can see here, we're not really sure how many people were in Canada, right? Nobody had counted, but there were several 100,000, if not maybe 1 million or 2 indigenous people in Canada, which is not a huge number of people, but for this time it's quite a bit, right? There was a good population of indigenous people, but look at that, with between 300 and 450 different languages spoken. Wow, that is a lot, right? So like I say, we talk about indigenous people as one group, but there are actually quite a number of distinct groups in that category, right?
Like this was the time before Columbus arrived.
Before Columbus, so this is before 1492. So there might have been a few more people by the time that Canada starts to get going, but nowhere near as many as today, obviously. And so some of the first people to start arriving in Canada from Europe are missionaries, right? So European missionaries are there to convert the indigenous people, right? They believe that not only do they believe in their God, but they feel that they need to spread the good news, right? And so there are missionaries here trying to convert indigenous people. There are traders here as well, right? Trying to form business relationships with indigenous people. So again, Europe really wanted furs, and there was lots and lots of furry animals here in Canada. And so they traded furs for things that indigenous people wanted, right? So,
Indigenous people invaded?
what's that?
Indigenous people weren't invaded?
Not right now, right? Although, people just kind of showed up, but it's not an invasion, right? So what it is just traders, right? And there's very few of them, and they're just trying to make business deals with the indigenous people, and they do, right? So the indigenous people provide lots of furs, and in exchange they get blankets and
Wasn't it hard?
metal axes and what?
Wasn't it hard to communicate as they
Yeah,
had a different language?
yeah, but you know, it's pretty easy, right? It's like, here, I'll show you. Okay, or no, hang on. And now, you can go up and put something there of yours that you want to trade, right? So let's say you put that little remote, okay? That's yours. And so now, if I accept your trade, I'll take the remote, right? If I don't accept it, I'll take my mug back. Yeah, yeah, it's very, you can, you know, at first it probably wasn't easy, but of course, you know, people can learn other languages, right? So Europeans started to learn, you know, some words in indigenous languages. Indigenous people started to learn some European words. Yeah, they worked it out, right? And so there was lots of trade going on early on. Again, indigenous people getting blankets and matches and, you know, metal axe heads and things that they could use, and Europeans were getting furs, right, which they wanted. So it was kind of a mutually beneficial relationship, right? And you can kind of see that, well, we'll get to that in a second. Yeah, it was kind of a mutually beneficial relationship. There was lots of indigenous people here. There was very few traders, right? There was very few explorers. So, you know, the Europeans were a very small minority here in North America at this time. Okay, let's take a little break, and then when we come back, I'll continue this story, okay? All right. Okay, people, without further ado, let's continue. So, as I mentioned here, when we first kind of start the indigenous, non-indigenous relationship here, it's pretty even. And in fact, it's really the indigenous people that have the power, right? This is their home. There are thousands and thousands of them. They've lived here for thousands of years. And the explorers that come don't really know anything at first, right? They don't know where they are. They don't know how to get around. They don't know how to find food. And the indigenous people kind of help them with that, right? And so it's kind of a relationship in which the indigenous people are the ones that have the power, right? That of course is going to shift, but we'll get to that. I think that kind of relationship is depicted quite well here in this image. So if you look at this image, you'll see this is an image that wasn't drawn at the time, okay, so it was drawn quite a bit later. But if we kind of analyze this image, what do you see? Do you see who kind of has the power in this image? Why do you say that?
Because it looks like there's so many of them and they're like standing bravely against them.
Right? So the indigenous people, there's quite a number of them, and they're all kind of standing, facing, and who are they facing?
Is that person?
Nope. But it is a
white guy.
a white guy. I think he's probably like a British
British
military guy. Yeah.
I think he's trying to communicate with indigenous people.
Yeah, trying to communicate. What do you think?
Giving them a hand of friendship or offering them some trade.
Yeah, maybe I think probably your first thing. I think maybe trying to offer the hand of friendship, right? He's got his hand out, and he's at the very least he's saying, I don't have a weapon. I'm not going to hurt anyone, right? So the indigenous people are kind of standing there. There's lots of them. This kind of British guy, it's just him and maybe a couple of his friends kind of hiding in the trees there.
Yeah.
What do you notice about the size relationships?
They're really tall and bulky, but the British people are not that tall and bulky.
Yeah, right? The indigenous people look really big in this image, right? And this guy he almost looks like child size,
Yeah.
right? Although I think, there's some perspective, right? Like he's further away. The British guy's further away than some of the indigenous people in the foreground, so there's some perspective there. But still, he looks tiny, right? And it looks like the indigenous people have the power. Do the indigenous people look concerned or afraid?
No.
No, they're just relaxed.
Pretty much, yeah. Look at those women in the front, right? They're just kind of sitting there,
Yeah, they're just
chatting.
resting.
Yeah, they don't look too alarmed. The men that are standing there in the front are kind of talking to each other, like, what do you make of this guy? Why is he so pale? Things like that, right? So, yeah, we start out in a relationship where indigenous people are kind of the ones that have the power, right? There are more of them, and they're in their home, right? They're in their actual land. Here's another picture in which you can see something similar. Here's an indigenous guy on the right, and there's an indigenous guy there kind of crouched down, smoking a pipe.
Yeah.
And yeah, they're trading some furs, right? Yeah. There's no violence here, right? There's no threats. It's just, two guys making a business deal, right? I'll give you these furs, you give me those blankets, or whatever, right? But things are going to start to go downhill for indigenous people starting at this time. One of the big factors that people often overlook is the arrival of new diseases in North America and South America. So the Europeans bring with them, not on purpose, but they bring with them tuberculosis and smallpox and measles and other things, chickenpox, and indigenous people here have no immunity to them, right? Because those diseases evolved in Europe, right? And they killed many, 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 many people in Europe. And so the Europeans who are left have some sort of a little more genetic resistance to these diseases. But indigenous people don't, right? They have never, before 1600, no indigenous person had seen tuberculosis before, right? And so the diseases have a pretty significant effect on their communities. And, we can imagine this with COVID, right? Because COVID was a new virus that no human had ever seen, right? And so we were all susceptible to it until we were vaccinated, right? And so here, these diseases tear through indigenous communities. Huge numbers of indigenous people die because they have no immunity to these diseases, and they have no vaccines, right? They have no medicine. They don't even know what it is, right? Nobody's ever had it before. Yeah, and so huge numbers of indigenous people.
That was the first time when these diseases got introduced.
Yeah, it's the first time. And so this is pretty devastating, as you can imagine, because lots of people in your community dying is a horrible thing to happen, right? But the other thing that makes it even worse is this, that for the most part, indigenous cultures in Canada never wrote anything down. Okay? They didn't really have a reason to. Most writing comes from agricultural communities who have to keep track of taxes, sadly. So indigenous people never really develop writing. They never really write anything down. All of their knowledge and their skills, their history, their stories, their myths, all of that is passed down orally, right? People tell stories and you just have to remember them. And who tends to be the people who remember all the old stories and the old knowledge? Who tends to do that in a community?
The older people.
The older people, right? Who do you think is more susceptible to disease? Older people, yeah. So,
Immunity is like very weak.
yeah. So older people are much more likely to die from these diseases, and they're kind of the repositories of knowledge for these people, right? They are. Does anyone back up their computer? Do you back up your computer? Yeah? Well, indigenous people are kind of or elders in the indigenous community are kind of the backup.
The iCloud.
They're the cloud, right? They remember all the stories, all of the old skills, all of the old knowledge, and they teach it to younger generations. But what happens when all those people die? You lose that knowledge, right? It's not written down anywhere. Nobody has it. And so if these people die before they pass it on, it's just gone, right? You lose it entirely. And so indigenous people suffer, what's that?
That's so sad.
It is so sad, right? And so it's a massive loss, not just in people, right? People are losing their parents and grandparents and brothers and sisters and children. Not only that, but they're losing a huge chunk of their cultural knowledge because it's held by those elders, right? So even though, the Europeans don't really try to do this, it's kind of an accident, it still has a pretty devastating effect on indigenous communities. Huge numbers of indigenous people die in the process. Another thing happens pretty early on. This doesn't seem like a big deal, but it is, particularly for indigenous people. It's this royal proclamation. Do you know what a proclamation is?
I've heard of it.
Yeah. When you proclaim something, it's like when you say it. You say it to be true. And it tends to be something like grand, right? So when the king says something, he proclaims it, right? And so here, the king, I think this is King George, by the way, he issues a proclamation saying this. It says, only the crown, so the government of Britain, only the crown can acquire lands from First Nations and only by treaty. Okay? So what the king is saying here is that, all you colonists who are in Canada, you might want to buy land from Indigenous people so that you can set up a little farm or a little house or something, but you can't do it. The government will not recognize your bill of sale. If you want to buy land, you have to buy it from the British government. The British government is the one who will kind of buy the land from Indigenous people. And then the British government will sell it back to you, the colonist, if you want it, right? So they're kind of making sure that, nobody's doing land deals with the Indigenous people. You have to go through the British government. And so, fine, that sounds boring, and it is, but what it says, or what it kind of admits, it admits that First Nations people are the owners of the land, does it not? If the British government says they're going to acquire the lands from First Nations, who owns the land? Well, here, if they're First Nations own it, right? They're the ones who own it because the government's going to acquire it from them. And so Indigenous people kind of place a lot of importance on this because right from the beginning, the British government has admitted that the land is theirs.
Indigenous people agreed to their land?
No, that comes later. But the idea here is that the British government admitted that it was theirs, right? It was theirs to begin with. So, right. Back to disease. Again, huge, massive population loss due to all of these new diseases. And again, a significant cultural loss as well, right? This is absolutely devastating. But there's other factors that kind of go along with the sort of struggle that Indigenous people will have to deal with. And again, the disease thing is not entirely on purpose, but some things were, right? So do you know what this is? Yeah, it's a bison, right? Or sometimes it's called a buffalo. Technically, it's not a buffalo, but we call them buffalo here. Yeah, it's an animal that you'll find in various parts of the world. Traditionally, you would find them kind of in central Canada, in the grasslands. You will not find many of them anymore, sadly. They are a magnificent animal. I don't know if they're on the verge of extinction, but there's very few of them. I don't know what their status is exactly, but there's not many. They're magnificent animals. If you ever see one, please do not approach one. They are not friendly at all. Cows are friendly. These guys are... They won't like you walking up to them. And they're very large. Although, actually, I just remembered this. One time, sometimes they sell bison meat. There's farms that they farm bison because the meat is kind of leaner than cow meat, so it's probably healthier for you, I guess. Anyway, I was living in Edmonton and I was walking to work and I walked around the corner in this strip mall where they had a butcher place that sold bison meat, and there was a bison, a live bison standing outside the butcher shop. And so I guess it was kind of tame. They had it on a rope or something, and I guess it was a promotion. There was a sale on bison meat. And literally and I literally turned the corner and there's a bison standing there in the middle of a city. Weird. But anyway, there's not really that many of them anymore. Again, they do farm them for meat sometimes. But prior to the arrival of Europeans, there were millions of these guys. Millions and millions. Apparently, the herd of bison if you were on a hill, it looked like a brown carpet moving over the landscape. There were so many of them. And many Indigenous people in central Canada would really make their living off of this animal. So they would hunt the bison, and basically the bison would provide them with almost everything they needed, right? They would eat every part of the bison. They would use its bones for, what's that? They're wild, yeah. They would use their bones for tools. They would use their hooves for tools, their horns for things. They would take their skins and make them into clothing or into their sort of tents, their teepees. Those are covered in the skin of the bison. The bison would provide them with really almost everything they needed, right? This was their kind of one-stop shop. But sadly, that was going to be a problem because, first of all, yeah. First of all, Indigenous people, were still living in, throughout Canada, throughout North America, and that was going to be a problem for the Canadian government. Okay, I'll just let you finish that, and then I'll get these ones here. Yeah. It's nice that the sun came out, but.
People can start raining at 1 p.m.
Because what?
People can start raining at 1 p.m.
Oh, 1 p.m.? Okay. Okay, so, sorry about that. Now, this is a problem. So, the Canadian government, so after Canada was created in 1867, what we saw was that there was some provinces in the east, right? There was British Columbia that was sort of forming, and then there was a whole bunch of nothing in the middle, right? And of course, it wasn't nothing. There were Indigenous people living there as they had for thousands of years, hunting these bison here. But that was going to be a problem for the Canadian government, right? Because they wanted people to settle in the central part of Canada, right? They wanted people to go there and farm, right? Because first of all, our first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, he wanted to create a country that went from sea to shining sea, right? So in order to do that, he had to get people settled in the rest of Canada, right? But he was also worried about the Americans, right? Because the Americans were kind of moving west, sort of creating their country, and he was worried that they might come north and start settling in the central part of Canada, right? And then they'd be impossible to get rid of, right? So what the Canadian government needed to do was to establish farmers in the central part of Canada. But you can't have farms when you have giant herds of these things running around, right? They're going to trample all of your crops and destroy your farm. And so the government went about taking care of them. So they put out a bounty on bison. So you would get paid for every bison that you shot. And so some people went out and that was their job. They hunted bison and shot them. And basically they shot them all. So that's a pile of bison skulls.
Oh.
That guy is standing on, and certainly not the only pile either. So
It's a lot of.
So the Canadian government basically pays to exterminate these animals, right? Which they pretty much almost do, right? They're borderline extinct, right? And so there's some around now. You can find some of them in national parks. Some people have them on farms and they farm them for meat, but you won't see them wandering around in the wild really at all, right? And because, again, the Canadian government exterminated them from the landscape, right? So on the one hand, of course, that opened up the land for farming, right? You wouldn't have to worry about those, bison stomping all over your crops. But of course, what of the Indigenous people, right? The Indigenous people relied on that animal for everything. And now the animal is gone, right? There are no more of them. Now what? Right?
It's harder for them.
Yeah, right? What do you do when the thing that you depend on for everything in your life has now disappeared?
Look for something more that brings you the things that I need.
Well, they certainly did that, right? And they were certainly very adaptable. But, as the Canadian government continued to kind of develop that part of Canada and to bring farmers in, there was less and less land to hunt on, right? And there was fewer and fewer animals to live on as well, right? And so their food source starts to disappear, right? So that kind of leads us to the treaties. Now, a treaty is an agreement. This is the last thing I'll say today. The treaties are agreements, right? They're kind of agreements between the government and Indigenous people, and Indigenous people start to sign them mostly in central Canada because of this situation, right? By the time we get to kind of the late 1800s, most of the buffalo are gone, right? Lots of European settlers and farmers have, moved into the central part of Canada. BC is now a province. Canada is kind of happening, and Indigenous people pretty quickly realize that things are not going to go back to the way they were, right? That these Europeans have come, they have changed the landscape, they've killed the buffalo, they're setting up cities, there's more Europeans coming all the time, and that's not going to end, right? It's not going to go back to the way it was. And so they start to talk to the government and say, hey, let's have some sort of formal arrangement here, right? Let's make a deal so that, we formally let you into our land, and you will, owe us certain things in turn, right? So we'll have a relationship. You can come in here and use our land, and in compensation, you will give us these things, right? And that was kind of where the treaties started out, right? And again, Indigenous people probably weren't that interested in formalizing these relationships earlier, but as their life, their lifestyle was changing so quickly that they really needed to make a deal, right? Because they couldn't really live the way they used to live anymore, right? The resources were gone, right? The land had been taken over, right? There were cities and towns and railways and farms where there used to be just wilderness that they could hunt in, right? And so they were kind of in a position where they needed to make a deal with the government. And so yeah, and so these treaties are those things. But as we'll find out on Monday, the treaty relationships it doesn't really go very well again for Indigenous people, but we'll explain that on Monday. So I'll end it there. Keep in mind, of course, that we have a field trip on next Friday. Okay. I'm not sure if I mentioned this or not because I'm a couple things, but number one, we're going to go during the second block. Okay, that's when we're going to go. Yes. So if you have a class in second block, you have to let me know because I need to clear it with your second block teacher because I'm going to take you. Okay. We'll get back to school by third block, and actually, if you tell me your third block teacher, that'll help too because I can just. Oh yeah, it's pre-calc. Okay, I'll talk to, that's Will, right? I'll talk to Will about that. So we're gonna go during second block. I have a bus we will, at 10 o'clock, we'll go downstairs, we'll get on the bus, we'll be whisked away to the Museum of Anthropology for about an hour, hour and a half, and then the bus will bring us back, and you should be back just in time for block 3, okay? The other thing is the college will cover 80% of the cost of this field trip because I got to pay for the museum admission and for the bus. So I need $6 from each of you.
Transfer?
What's that?
Transfer?
Transfer? Yeah, we can figure that out next week. I'll need $6 from each of you. If the $6 is a lot of money, or if you can't pay it, come talk to me and we'll figure something out. Okay. We'll do that. If you're under 19, I'll need your parent or guardian to sign a permission slip saying that I can take you, but I'll have that for you next week. And I think that's it. Okay, so that's all for today. I'll see you on Monday. Have a nice weekend. Enjoy yourselves. Stay dry. Stay warm. See you Monday.